My name is Addison Crawford, and I'm 63 years old. For the past 35 years, I've poured my heart and soul into Crawford Industries, the manufacturing company my grandfather built from nothing in Detroit back in 1952. Today, as I stood outside the mahogany doors of our main conference room in our Chicago headquarters, my hands trembled slightly as I clutched a leather portfolio containing documents that could change everything. The November wind had been brutal that morning, whipping off Lake Michigan with a ferocity that made my cheeks burn during my walk from the parking garage. Now, inside the climate-controlled building, I could still feel that cold, but it wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was radiating from behind those closed doors, where my father, Richard Crawford, was conducting the quarterly shareholder meeting without me. I pressed my ear closer to the door, hearing his booming voice echo through the room. At 87, Dad had lost none of his commanding presence. Ladies and gentlemen, Crawford Industries has seen a 12% increase in revenue this quarter, he announced, and I could hear the pride swelling in his voice. That pride should have been mine to share. Those numbers existed because of strategies I'd developed, contracts I'd negotiated, and relationships I'd built over 3 decades of tireless work. My assistant, Marcus, a sharp 28-year-old MBA graduate who'd been with me for 2 years, appeared at my elbow. "Miss Crawford, I don't understand. Why aren't you in there?" I gave him a tight smile, the kind I'd perfected over years of swallowing disappointment. "Plans changed, Marcus." But that wasn't entirely true. Plans hadn't changed. I'd simply never been part of them in my father's eyes. Not really. My younger brother, Derek, sat at that table despite having spent the last decade in California running a tech startup that had failed spectacularly 3 years ago. My cousin, James, occupied a seat despite barely showing up to the office more than twice a month. But me? I was the senior vice president of operations, the person who actually kept this company running, and I was standing in the hallway like an intern. The meeting had started at 9 o'clock sharp. It was now 9:45. I'd arrived at 7:30, as I always did, prepared to present the operational improvements I'd implemented that had directly contributed to that revenue increase Dad was currently taking credit for. Instead, I'd found a hastily scribbled note on my desk from Diane, Dad's executive assistant. "Meeting roster finalized. RJC will handle operations report. RJC, Richard James Crawford." My father had shut me out with 3 initials and a curt sentence. Marcus shifted uncomfortably beside me. "This isn't right, Ms. Crawford. Last month, when the Canton plant almost lost the Midwest Motors contract, you flew out there personally and saved a $15 million deal." "Marcus, go back to the office," I said quietly. "I need you to pull the detailed operational reports from the last 5 years. Every project I've led, every contract I've secured, every efficiency improvement I've implemented. I want revenue impacts, cost savings, everything documented." His eyes widened slightly. "What are you planning?" I finally turned to look at him, and whatever he saw in my expression made him straighten his spine. "Just do it, please. Be thorough. I need to know exactly what my contributions have been worth to Crawford Industries." He nodded and hurried off down the corridor. I'd chosen that carpet during the renovation 3 years ago while Dad was recovering from a minor heart procedure, managing contractors and staying under budget while handling my regular responsibilities. The conference room doors suddenly swung open and shareholders began filing out. I recognized most of them. Elizabeth Hartman from the Hartman Family Trust, holding 22% of company shares. Robert Chen, an investment banker. Patricia O'Neill, representing a consortium of smaller investors. They nodded politely as they passed me, their eyes holding questions they were too diplomatic to ask aloud. Why wasn't Richard Crawford's daughter in that meeting? My father emerged last, surrounded by Derek, James, and 3 board members. He was laughing at something Derek had said, his hand clasping my brother's shoulder with unmistakable affection. Dad had always been striking, and age had only added gravitas to his presence. Silver hair perfectly combed, navy suit immaculate, the American flag pin he always wore gleaming on his lapel. He saw me standing there, and his expression flickered, just for a moment, with something that might have been guilt. "Addison," he said, his tone measured and formal. "I trust you've been managing things on the operations floor?" The operations floor, as if I were a factory supervisor instead of the senior vice president who'd restructured our entire supply chain last year, saving the company $8 million annually. "The meeting went well, I hear," I replied, matching his formality. I'm glad the board was pleased with our quarterly results. Very pleased, Derek interjected, that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. At 58, my brother had maintained his boyish charm, the golden child who could do no wrong. Dad presented the operations report brilliantly. Strategic vision I'd developed, operational improvements I'd implemented, my work, my strategy, my vision, presented by someone else while I stood outside the room. I'd like to speak with you, Dad, I said, keeping my voice level. In your office, privately. Richard Crawford glanced at his watch, a Rolex I'd given him for his 80th birthday. I have a lunch meeting with the Hartman Trust representatives in 20 minutes. Perhaps this afternoon? This afternoon then, I agreed, though we both knew these delays were his specialty. I watched them walk away toward the executive elevators. They didn't invite me. They never did. The afternoon meeting never happened. Dad's assistant called at 2:30 to reschedule for the following week. I spent the rest of the day in my office, reviewing the comprehensive documentation Marcus had compiled. The numbers were staggering. Over the past 5 years alone, my initiatives had generated an additional $47 million in revenue. Cost-cutting measures I'd implemented had saved another $23 million. I'd negotiated contracts worth over $200 million. I'd modernized our manufacturing processes, reducing waste by 35%. I'd built relationships with key clients that had led to contract renewals when competitors were circling. Crawford Industries' success wasn't just about the Crawford name anymore. It was about the Crawford who showed up every single day and did the work. That evening, I drove home to my condo in Lincoln Park as the sun set over the Chicago skyline. I'd bought this condo 15 years ago, after my divorce from Thomas. It was my sanctuary, decorated with art I'd collected from local galleries and furniture I'd chosen because it made me happy. I poured myself a glass of wine and stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights. My reflection stared back at me, a woman with shoulder-length auburn hair touched with silver that I'd stopped dyeing 2 years ago. I'd inherited my mother's high cheekbones and my father's intense gray eyes. My phone buzzed. A text from my daughter, Sarah, who was 35 and working as a civil engineer in Seattle. Mom, just checking in. How was your day? I smiled despite myself. Complicated, I texted back. But I'm working through something important. Love you. Love you too, Mom. Remember, you're brilliant and you've earned everything you have. My daughter's words settled over me like armor. She was right. I had earned everything. The question was, what was I going to do about it? The next morning, I arrived at the office at 6:30. I spent 2 hours in the legal department's library, reviewing incorporation documents, shareholder agreements, and company bylaws. What I found there changed everything. My grandfather, William Crawford, had included specific provisions in the original corporate structure, provisions that had been buried under decades of amendments, but were still legally binding. One provision in particular caught my attention. Any family member holding an executive vice president position or higher, with documented contributions to company growth exceeding $25 million over a 5-year period, had the right to call for a vote of confidence regarding executive leadership succession. I had exceeded that threshold by nearly double. The provision specified that such a vote must be conducted by an independent mediator, with all shareholders given the opportunity to cast votes weighted by their ownership percentage. It was a safeguard my grandfather had installed to prevent any one family member from consolidating too much power. I photographed every relevant page with my phone. This was it. This was how I could force my father to see me, to acknowledge what I'd contributed. Marcus found me in the library at 8:15. Ms. Crawford, your father wants to see you in his office at 9. Perfect timing, I said. Tell him I'll be there. I spent the next 45 minutes preparing my case like I would for any crucial negotiation. This was perhaps the most important presentation of my life. At precisely 9 o'clock, I walked into my father's corner office with its sweeping views of downtown Chicago. On the walls hung photographs documenting Crawford Industries' history. I appeared in exactly 3 of those photographs, always in the background, always peripheral. Addison, thank you for coming, Dad said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I wanted to discuss your role going forward. Something in his tone made my stomach tighten. My role? He steepled his fingers. Derek and I have been talking about the future of Crawford Industries. It's time to start thinking seriously about succession planning. I agree completely, I said carefully. I'm glad you understand. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Derek has agreed to step into a more active role as Executive Vice President of Strategic Development. He'll be working closely with me to prepare for eventually taking over as CEO. The words hit me like a physical blow. Not me. Derek, the son who'd barely been involved in the business for a decade, the golden boy who'd failed at his own ventures and was now being handed the keys to our family's legacy. I see, I said quietly. And where do I fit into this succession plan? Dad had the grace to look uncomfortable. You'll continue in your current role, of course. Operations is crucial. We'll need your expertise to support Derek during the transition. Support Derek. Report to Derek. Watch Derek receive the recognition, the authority, the respect that I'd spent 35 years earning. No, I said. My father blinked. Excuse me? No, I repeated, opening my portfolio and placing the first document on his desk. I'm not going to continue in my current role while you hand my brother a position he hasn't earned. Addison, I understand you're disappointed, but… Disappointed? I let out a laugh. Dad, I've generated $70 million in growth and savings over the past 5 years alone. I've secured the contracts that keep our factories running. I've modernized our operations while you and Derek were at steakhouse lunches. I placed another document on his desk. This is a comprehensive analysis of every major initiative I've led, every project I've managed, every dollar I've made or saved for Crawford Industries. Dad glanced at the papers but didn't pick them up. Your contributions are appreciated, but executive leadership requires more than operational excellence. It requires a penis, apparently, I interrupted, and his face flushed with anger. That's inappropriate. Is it? I stood, placing my hands flat on his desk. Tell me, Dad, what does Derek bring to this company that I don't? Because from where I'm standing, the only difference between us is that he's your son and I'm merely your daughter. You're being emotional. I'm being factual, I corrected. And here's another fact. I placed the corporate bylaws on his desk, open to the relevant section with the text highlighted. Grandfather William included provisions for exactly this situation. Family members in my position, with my track record, have the right to call for a vote of confidence regarding succession decisions. My father stared at the bylaws for a long moment, his expression hardening. When he finally looked up at me, I saw something I'd never seen before. Respect mixed with wariness. You're threatening me, he said slowly. I'm exercising my rights under the corporate structure your father established, I corrected. Grandfather William built safeguards to ensure the company would always be run by the most qualified family members, not just passed down like a crown. William intended exactly this, I interrupted. He saw what happened to other family businesses when succession became about favoritism instead of competence. He told me himself, when I was 25, that stopped my father short. I rarely invoked my relationship with my grandfather, but it had been deep and meaningful. William Crawford had died 15 years ago, but I still missed our weekly breakfast meetings where he'd shared his wisdom. Grandfather told me the company would need someone with vision and grit to carry it into the future, I continued. He said the person who loved the work itself would be the one to lead Crawford Industries through changing times. He was talking about me, Dad. The silence stretched between us, heavy with 35 years of unspoken disappointments. Outside his windows, Chicago went about its business. Inside this office, something fundamental was shifting. What exactly are you proposing? Dad finally asked. I pulled out a typed document I'd drafted the night before. I'm formally requesting a vote of confidence, as is my right under Article 7, Section 3. The vote will address 2 questions. First, whether the shareholders believe Derek is qualified for Executive Vice President given his limited experience. Second, whether I should be given equal consideration for the CEO succession plan. You're trying to take over the company, Dad said. I'm trying to ensure the company survives and thrives, I corrected. Dad, I love Crawford Industries. I've dedicated my entire adult life to it. I'm trying to preserve Grandfather's legacy by making sure it's passed to someone who will protect it. I leaned forward. You're 87 years old. You've had an incredible run, but it's time to think about what's truly best for the company, not what's most comfortable or traditional. Dad walked to his windows, his back to me. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. Your mother would have been proud of you, he said quietly. She always said you had more Crawford steel in you than anyone. Mom had died 12 years ago from cancer, and I still felt her absence like a phantom limb. She told me once that she wished she'd been born in a different generation, I said softly. One where her ideas would have been valued. I've tried to honor her by being the woman she never got the chance to be. Dad turned to face me, and I was startled to see his eyes were wet. You think I don't see what you've done? You think I don't know how much this company depends on you? Then why, Dad? The question burst out of me. Why have you spent decades overlooking me, dismissing me? Why is Derek suddenly the heir apparent while I'm still fighting for scraps of recognition? He was quiet for a long moment. Because it's always been done this way. Because my father passed the company to me, and I always assumed I'd pass it to my son. Because, he paused, because it's easier to follow tradition than to admit when tradition is wrong. It was the most honest my father had been with me in decades. The admission hung in the air between us, a fragile bridge across years of hurt. Tradition shouldn't come at the expense of common sense, I said gently. Or what's best for the people who depend on Crawford Industries for their livelihoods. We employ 800 people, Dad. They deserve leaders chosen for their competence, not their gender. Dad picked up the bylaws, reading through the section I'd highlighted. If I agree to this vote, you understand it could get ugly? Derek won't go down without a fight. Let them show their true colors, I said firmly. I'm not afraid of a fair fight. I'm only afraid of never getting the chance to fight at all. He studied me for a long moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll consult with legal and arrange for an independent mediator. We'll schedule the vote for 3 weeks from today. And the CEO succession discussion? I pressed. Will be part of the vote, he agreed. The shareholders will recommend who they believe should be positioned as my successor based on qualifications and track record. It wasn't everything I wanted, but it was a door opening. After 35 years of being invisible, that was something. Thank you, Dad, I said. As I reached the door, he called out, Addison? I turned back. Make your case well, he said. Because if the shareholders vote for you, I'll respect that decision. Part of me hopes they do. The 3 weeks leading up to the vote were the most intense of my career. Derek immediately went on the offensive, scheduling meetings with major shareholders and painting me as divisive. He emphasized his fresh perspective and strategic vision, despite his inability to articulate what either actually meant. I took a different approach. I let the numbers speak for themselves. Marcus and I prepared individual presentations for each major shareholder, documenting exactly how my work had impacted their investment returns. I showed Elizabeth Hartman how my efficiency improvements had increased profit margins by 18%. I walked Robert Chen through the risk mitigation strategies that had protected Crawford Industries during supply chain disruptions. I demonstrated to Patricia O'Neill's consortium how the client relationships I'd cultivated had created stable revenue streams. I didn't attack Derek. I didn't need to. His track record spoke for itself. The independent mediator, Helen Rodriguez, was a retired corporate attorney in her 70s, sharp as a tack, with steel gray hair and intelligent dark eyes that missed nothing. Ms. Crawford, she said during our interview, I've spent 30 years mediating corporate disputes. I've rarely seen documentation as comprehensive as yours. You make a compelling case. This isn't just about me, I replied. It's about what's best for Crawford Industries. Helen smiled slightly. That's exactly the kind of answer I'd hoped to hear from a future CEO. The vote was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early December. Chicago had been hit by an early snowstorm the night before, and I watched from my condo windows as the city transformed into a winter wonderland. It felt symbolic, a fresh start. I dressed with care that morning, choosing a charcoal suit, my mother's pearl necklace, and the watch my grandfather had given me at business school graduation. I looked at myself in the mirror and saw a woman who'd earned every gray hair, every line, every bit of confidence. You've got this, Addison, I told my reflection. The vote was held in the same conference room where I'd been excluded 3 weeks earlier. This time, I walked through those doors with my head held high. All major shareholders were present. Derek sat with Dad. I sat with Marcus beside me. Helen Rodriguez opened the proceedings, then invited Derek to present first. He delivered a 20-minute presentation about innovation and transforming Crawford Industries into a 21st century powerhouse. But when Robert Chen asked specific questions about supply chain management, Derek fumbled. When Elizabeth Hartman questioned operational efficiency, he gave vague answers about bringing in consultants. When Patricia O'Neill pressed him on client relationships, he admitted he'd need to get up to speed. Then it was my turn. I stood and looked at each shareholder in turn. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to talk about vision or innovation. I'm going to talk about results. I walked them through 35 years of dedication, focusing on the past 5 years. I showed them the $47 million in additional revenue my initiatives had generated, the $23 million in cost savings, the $200 million in contracts secured, the 35% reduction in waste, the client retention rate that had climbed from 72% to 94%. These aren't projections or promises, I said. These are facts. This is what I've already done for your investments and for the 800 employees who depend on this company. I paused, making eye contact with my father. I love this company. I've given it everything I have. I'm not asking you to vote for me because I'm a Crawford. I'm asking you to vote for me because I've proven year after year that I'm the person who will protect your investments and honor the legacy that 3 generations have built. The room was silent when I sat down. Helen explained the voting process. Each shareholder would submit their votes privately, weighted by their ownership percentage. The next 30 minutes felt like 30 hours. I sat at the conference table, trying to control my breathing. Marcus touched my arm gently. Whatever happens, you should be proud. Finally, Helen returned with a sealed envelope. She stood at the head of the table. The results are decisive. By a margin of 78% to 22%, the shareholders have voted in favor of Addison Crawford being positioned as the primary successor for CEO. Additionally, by 71% to 29%, the shareholders have recommended against creating the executive vice president position for Derek Crawford at this time. The room erupted. Elizabeth Hartman started clapping. Robert Chen nodded vigorously. Patricia O'Neill smiled. Marcus grabbed my hand. But I was looking at my father. He stood slowly, walked around the table, and extended his hand to me. When I stood and took it, he pulled me into an embrace. "Your grandfather would be so proud," he whispered, "and so am I. I'm sorry it took me so long to see what was right in front of me." I felt tears prick my eyes but blinked them back. "Thank you, Dad. That means everything." He pulled back, keeping his hands on my shoulders. "We'll work out a transition plan. I want you to start taking on more CEO responsibilities immediately. You've earned it." Derek had left without a word. That evening, Dad would reach out to him, but that was between them. As the shareholders congratulated me and the meeting broke up, I stood at those windows looking out over Chicago. The snow had stopped, and weak December sunlight was breaking through the clouds. Somewhere out there, 800 employees were depending on Crawford Industries. I pulled out my phone and texted Sarah. "The vote went our way. I'm going to be CEO." Her response came immediately. "I never doubted you for a second. Proud doesn't even begin to cover it." 3 months later, the transition was official. Richard Crawford remained as chairman, but I became CEO of Crawford Industries. The response was overwhelmingly positive. My first major initiative was establishing a mentorship program for young women in manufacturing. My second was implementing profit sharing for all employees. My third was commissioning a new photograph from my father's office wall, me standing in front of the Canton plant with our workforce. When the photographer delivered it, I took it to Dad's office myself. He was reviewing contracts, still unable to completely step back. "I brought you something," I said, holding up the framed photograph. When he saw it, his face softened. "That's perfect, Addison." He pointed to a space next to the photograph of him and my grandfather at the original factory groundbreaking. I hung it carefully. 3 generations of Crawfords, all united by commitment to the company. "You know what I realized?" Dad said. "I spent years trying to follow tradition that I almost destroyed the best tradition. Earning your place through hard work. You embodied that better than anyone, and I almost couldn't see it. We see it now," I said, taking his hand. "That's what matters." As I left his office that day and walked through Crawford Industries, my responsibility now, I thought about that November morning when I'd stood outside those conference room doors, excluded and invisible. That version of Addison Crawford had been invisible to her father, overlooked by her brother. But she'd never been invisible to the people who mattered most, the clients who trusted her, the employees who respected her, the shareholders who valued her, and most importantly, to herself. I'd taken my place at the table not by waiting for it to be offered, but by proving I'd earned it, by refusing to accept being overlooked. At 63 years old, I was just getting started. Crawford Industries had a future, and I was going to make sure it was bright, for every person who'd supported me, for every employee who depended on us, and for every woman who'd come after me and deserved to know that their contributions mattered, their voices deserved to be heard, and their place at the table was theirs to claim.